The Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative was born with a big bang in 2003, with the mandate to increase transparency in the extractive sector. So, 15 years on, have things actually improved? As its executive director Jonas Moberg steps down, he joins Raw Talks for an exclusive exit interview. For more than 10 years, you led the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, best known as ITIE. August this year, you stepped down. Tell me about your decision to leave the ITIE. Why now?
Well, as you say, 10 years, that's a long time. It was, I'm sure, time for ITIE to have a different leadership and time for me to do something else. It has been a wonderful experience and journey and very exciting and fortunate to have been, you know, given the responsibility, the trust during that time. But you know, all things are passing, and now was a good moment.
Let me read a recent quote from you. You said that the EITI has become the global governance standard in the extractive sector for all its flaws and challenges. So what are those flaws and challenges that you allude to?
Well, we haven't got time for all of them here and now. It's, you know, having enough, that governments have enough resources to implement the ITI. As I said, there can be very powerful interests, you know, that prevents implementation. On the civil society side, civil society has been, I think, quite remarkably successful in campaigning for improved governance and push for things like the ITI and be part of developing things like the ITI. But we mustn't just campaign, we must also be part of the solutions. Civil society must learn how to use this information. We have big data, we have EITI and so on. Now let's use it. Our journalists, do they have the capacity to analyze, to turn information into questions? Do politicians have the ability to turn this information into questions in parliaments and so on? And then on the corporate side, there are many challenges there too. I guess a key one is to make sure that governments, that companies really continue to support the ITI.
There has been some companies in the US that has pulled back their support in a way.
Well, there have been some companies that haven't always supported some of the laws that arguably have been mutually reinforcing with the ITI, and that's regrettable. But then, you know, a company might say one thing here and not always deliver there, and then there are a number of companies that the ITI has not managed to engage. Absolutely, not so much on the mining side, but on the oil and gas side, a massive group, if you like, that we have not worked well with enough are the national oil companies, the state oil companies, which are often enormous. Most of the world's oil is actually owned by them. But they often also operate quite commercially, and many of them are in absolute need of reform. They have big corruption problems and so on. So engaging them more is a big issue for the ITI.
The EITI was born in 2003 with a big bang. It was a significant international effort. And back then it was the beginning of the commodities boom, and transparency was really at center stage. But it doesn't seem to be that anymore. How can we keep momentum going? That's
all by and large true. But, you know, you don't always need headlight attention to you know, to do good work. And if you actually look at the extent to which the ITI is covered in the media, it's probably covered much more today, but more widely across the world. So it depends a little bit on through which lens you look at the attention and so on. You know, if you were to be in Nigeria, for example, NETI, as they call it there, is in the news, if not daily, at least weekly, pretty much. So I think that to some extent, unfortunately, the need for things like the ITI we're daily reminded of by corruption scandals and poor governance in so many parts of the world. And we see how it is changing, democracy and elections and whatnot. Sadly, I think that the need for it is as strong as ever.
In terms of the scope of the ITI, most think of it as disclosure of payments and revenues, but it has added other items such as beneficial ownership, contract transparency, commodity training. You talked about state-owned companies. But is there a risk with this expansion of spreading too thin?
No, I don't think so. I think you're right. It's a really good question, and I've always said that the extent to which the ITI has been successful, I'm firmly believing in that. It's because it has a very sharp focus on transparency about these things. We are more successful not by being expansive, but by doing this aspect more deeply better. In that sense, I am very much in favor of keeping a narrow focus. It's just that ownership disclosure is actually part of that narrow focus. We do need to know who is behind these big companies. I mean, why is it that if I want to borrow a book at my local library, I need to show my ID? But I can actually run a mine, dig a massive hole in the ground that affects thousands of people without actually revealing who I am. That's not okay. That's not good enough. So that ownership disclosure is necessary for some basic good governance. And
you mentioned one of the challenges, which is the capacity in government, but adding things must add an extra burden on that capacity. How do you manage that?
I'm not sure actually, because we need clear, easily accessible information. And if we add, for example, beneficial ownership disclosure, and if we get that going in a systematic and easy way, that actually ought to make some of the things easier, not more difficult. This idea of, it's becoming so burdensome, maybe in some aspects we're asking for information that is not needed, and then EITI need to rein itself back a little bit. So there were, for example, some EITI reports that were thousands of pages requiring all kinds of information, and in those sorts of circumstances we haven't got it right. It has to be relevant information. It has but ownership disclosure, as I've said, is part of that.
I'm interested in how you look at EITI in the bigger resource agenda, because transparency is good in itself, but as you mentioned, the ultimate objective must be good governance overall and good resource governance. Is that how you look upon it?
Absolutely.
You care to elaborate? How does transparency fit into that?
Well, look,
it's just one part of a very broad resource governance.
You're dead right, but the ITI is not only about transparency, I would argue. You have an EITI national commission in each of our countries. So you have something like 1,400 people around the world in our 51 countries that serve on those. That builds trust. It's about accountability. It's way more than transparency. But transparency is unquestionable. It's very hard to be against transparency. So it is a very neat, I would say, elegant and reasonable place for the conversation to start. But you're absolutely right. It then becomes an effort about good governance much more widely.
But it's an interesting question, how you measure EITI's impact. How have you gone about it so far?
It is an interesting question, and it's a tough one to answer because the impact in one country is very different from the impact in another country. A lot of people want statistics, and then unless you provide statistics, they doubt that there is impact. And I can give you statistics on that. For example, in Nigeria, the Treasury has worked out that they found a lot of unpaid taxes. amounting to several $billion. So they've got a pretty clear idea of the amount of unpaid tax that has been identified and consequently paid as a consequence of the ITI. So, as a colleague often said, Nigeria alone and what they are saving in collecting those taxes ought to be more than enough for my colleagues and I to get out of bed in the morning. Then there are, corruption things that have been revealed as a consequence of the ITI, and you have researchers that have said, we have found this. For example, some things that have happened in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have found this as a consequence of the DRC's implementation of the ITI. And then you have some companies that say, look, we would not have invested many billions in a country had it not been implementing the ITI because we were so worried about the governance in that country. You have to bring all of that together and look at the impact.
Can you see that EITI member countries actually have more investment or more exploration, for example, than non-EITI member countries?
I don't think you can statistically see it, but you can certainly get sort of anecdotes or systematize them with people that say, look, we had an investment decision and EITI had an impact.
It seems like it's much down to the national organization of the ITI.
That's true, and I think we talked a lot about the ITI challenges. I think is the one thing, if I may, that the ITI has got right. It is that it has a national ownership. There is nothing we are as proud of as the fact that we don't have a logo policy protecting the ITI logo. We have a logo policy encouraging the national development of it. And so there are 51 EITI logos. And so I think that and that illustrates that there is quite a strong national ownership. So we got that right, but there is a global standard that has to be followed. So the global architecture is pretty important too.
Another thing that the ITI has been lauded for is its multi-stakeholder forum form, which is both on a national and international level. And you actually co-authored a book on multi-stakeholderism entitled Beyond Governments. I'm wondering, in times of rising nationalism, global polarization, is there a role for multi-stakeholder consensus-based organizations such as the ITI?
Don't you think that there is an even bigger role for it because of the kinds of global developments that you're talking about? That would be my hypothesis. That said, that book was not meant to be a song of praise for multi-stakeholderism. Mm-hmm. Actually, to some extent, what we were doing was looking at the ITI and saying that this is quite difficult. And one should really probably only resort to multi-stakeholder governance when all other things fail. And that's in part why it was called, for example, Beyond Governments. It is really only when government absolutely can't govern itself that you probably need different forms of multi-stakeholders.
But you saw that it was a good model for EITI.
Yeah, because I think that is one of those questions that are so difficult to solve through other means. So yes, it's needed there, and it is needed in many other areas. But one should not just jump into it and assume that every problem has a multi-stakeholder solution. I think one should take a bit of care and look a little bit at what kind of groups one forms.
Let's turn to the future. You have previously stated that the EITI standard is too rigid. Why is that, and how do you see it evolving?
So I think the EITI reporting needs to become more timely.
Timely in what sense?
So some of the EITI reports are published too late. So there's too long time lag between the year it covers and when it's published. So it needs to become real-time reporting. And as I said before, probably report less but more relevant. Need to report there's still some EITI reporting that isn't available online and so on. So, we need to make sure that we can bring all the relevant data to everyone's mobile phone. Now we have mobile phones even quite prevalent in the poorest countries in the world, and that is how people use this sort of information. And we need to make sure that the ITI is user-friendly.
Your successor has been pointed out, and it's going to be Mark Robinson from World Resource Institute. What word of advice would you give him?
Well, firstly, I of course wish him good luck. I guess empathy is a virtue that I hope has often guided me. So maybe I'll leave that one behind to him. My point being that the success of the ITI depends on an ability to communicate with everything from poor mining affected communities to wealthy oil executives, and you really have to be able to, from within the ITI, to communicate, to understand where they are coming from, essentially to make, above all, governments, ministers understand and feel that the ITI is important to their agenda. So selling it to them by understanding where they are coming from and what drives them is key.
Jonas, thank you very much for joining Raw Talks, and good luck.
Thank you.
And to keep up with the debate on extractives and development, join us at rawtalks.org.